It's time to get our CBDs humming again.
He's the Prime Minister, and the fact...
Hello, Queenslanders. I wanted to take some time.
And we need to plan for our future.
Done a level of good work in trying to maintain their economies and also keep people safe. So that's probably a key factor. What's also fascinating about the Queensland election is the One Nation vote that collapsed shows possibly the first sign as and I think Brent and I spoke about this probably 6 or 7 years ago, that they're probably off the boil again, which they were always going to do at some point, because they're a grievance party, which being in the sense that people vote for them when they are fed up with the others. So now that when you get to an election like this, which was obviously fairly crucial in the time of that it occurs, you have people going, well, I'm not going to waste my vote. I'm going to give it to the person that I think is actually doing a good job. And so that's, I think, what you've seen, because the Greens actually had a swing against them on their primary vote as well. So even though they won South Brisbane, so there's some fascinating things. There'll be more to unpack. Elections take a heck of a lot of unpacking when you actually want to see the trends, and that's something that I'm an absolute nerd at. So when it comes to elections, I love them more than many things. But anyway.
Cool. Thanks, Simon. So that's where it was sitting this morning. So the Labor will comfortably win government. So work to do for the LNP up here. So getting to the nuts and bolts of how to contact your local councillor or MP. So working in the office, there's a number of different ways people can make contact. And this is pretty standard across all three levels. So ward and electorate emails are available on the web, and they will, generally speaking, go to the office manager. So I would suggest, rather than writing Dear Milton, Dear Mr. O'Brien, I would address them to the office manager, because that will be the person who is the gatekeeper in most instances. So an email to start off with, as an introductory email as to who you are and what you do and why you would like to meet with them. An email to start off with is the way to go. Keeping in mind is in that those generic email addresses literally receive hundreds of emails every single day, non-stop. So you've got petitions coming in, you've got other requests similar to yours, you've got schools, you've got other businesses, there's community groups, there's spam, there's invitations. I know at a federal level, the amount of invitations that come through for events that are on at Parliament would blow your mind. As a federal MP, if you wanted to, you could go to a function in Federal Parliament House from breakfast to dinner 5 days a week when Parliament is there. There is an event on in any particular room that you've been invited to at any one time. So when Parliament's sitting, their time is very valuable. So that's why the office manager and the staff in the office are the key people to address and to speak to. So following that, if you don't hear a response in a few days, most of them have autoresponders, but if you don't hear a response in a few days, you can then follow up with a phone call. And again, if you jump on the Queensland electorate site or the federal MP, you'll find their landline number to call them. If you're really, really keen, this always surprised me when I was sitting in the Parliament House office. Some people will go to the trouble of finding the Parliament House office number. And so people would call when we were down there. But a phone call a few days later, just to check that your email's been received, is the way to go. A bit of a backdoor is Facebook. So the messages on there are generally monitored by someone like myself, who'd be like the media and communications advisor. That's a bit of a backdoor to getting in and getting contact with your MP. So if you can send them a message on Facebook, less so Instagram, but if you send them a direct message on Facebook, that's also another way to talk to them. I know I always got back to people quicker from a Facebook message rather than an email. So that's a little bit of a backdoor. You can even, I think most offices also have a fax machine, but I don't think we ever received a fax. But Facebook would be the way to go. And then on their website, most of them will also have a contact form where you can get in touch with them as well. But I think approaching the office manager, becoming friends with them, giving them a call, they're the person that sets the diary, that sets the timetables. They're someone who you want to get friendly with. And then also at the same time, understanding that you've got something to sell and give as well. All MPs, all politicians, no matter their persuasion, are always up for a photo op. They're always looking for good PR. You know, to come in and a simple line of saying, hey, I'd love to come in, meet Milton, tell him about my business, grab a photo, would love the opportunity of a bit of his time. That's a carrot you can dangle. They love it. They all do. Before you do that though, there's a bit of research that you should know. So I found many a times where people came in and had meetings with Milton and myself, that they knew a lot about them, but didn't know a lot about us. So you should know which party do they belong to. It's not hard to find out, but that's your initial starting point to finding what sort of language they like. What do they want to talk about? If it's a Labor member and you can go and start talking about your local community, schools, health. Not saying that Liberal members don't like that stuff, but that's your bread and butter of your progressive left-wing parties. Liberal members, you know, that business, economic side of things, if you're a real business person talking about finance numbers, I think they'll be much more in tune to talk about that as well. So having a bit of an idea as to what party that they belong to and what they might be interested in. How long have they been in office? People who are newbies, like any job, might be a little bit deer in the headlights, as opposed to someone who might be in there 16, 17, 18 years. These are just good talking points for you to get the conversation going, building that relationship and letting them know that you've done your research and you're here to play the game. What faction do they belong to? Simon, can I throw straight to you? I want to hear from your point of view first, and then I'm happy to give my points.
So, and it's interesting, yeah. So on the research thing, and it's I can't tell you how important that is. I sat through a meeting with my old member where his name's Ted, and there was an organisation that came to pitch him on his support for a particular project, and they brought their CEO up and the whole shebang, and there was about 5 of them around the room, and the CEO starts talking and starts calling him Tom, and calls him Tom consistently through an hour-long meeting, to the point where we just gave up. Like, when you try to, and I would say, hey, yeah, so Ted, you know, what do you think of it? And he just didn't pick up. So it's a point of hilarity for us when the moment they leave, but certainly it's important. Another quick one to do is there's a maiden speech, which is the first speech a member ever gives. That's pretty much what every member that when they go into Parliament, that's who they are, that's their family, that's their background, that's why I'm actually here. They're the questions a politician, whether it's state or federal, will answer in their maiden speech. And so a maiden speech is always available on the parliamentary websites of the day, and certainly is a very good source of information. As far as factions go, that'll certainly flow in. There's and I guess.
Do you want maybe from the get-go, just in case,
yep.
Like what are factions?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I was going to. Where the factions sort of lay is where when you think about the right and the left of politics, and the right is, when you think about it in modern times, is right would be seen as capitalism. Left would be seen as socialism, and then you sort of have it, you know, go towards the middle. So if you think about the right, is often seen as it is often referred to as conservative or the Liberal Party. The left, obviously Labor, and then left of the Labor Party is the Greens. Right of the Liberal Party is interestingly is One Nation. So the factions within the Liberal Party, for example, we would say is the conservative faction are those more to the right than the left. And those, then you have what would be called moderates, who are slightly left of that, and then you would have progressives who are in that sort of thing. So you have 3. They're not in the Liberal Party defined factions. They are more undertones and undercurrents, and one of the most obvious examples of where they actually make a difference in policy is when you get big and contentious policy matters. In the Liberal Party especially, which is the 2 major ones that I can think of are energy, and particularly the downfall of Malcolm Turnbull, and then marriage equality, are 2 where faction lines are where come to the fore in really big policy matters and big arguments. Whereas Voluntary assisted dying is one that's currently being debated down in Tasmania. And once again, you'll see that on factional lines in the party itself, which doesn't, in the Liberal Party, rear its head that often, but in other states it does, and certainly in the Labor Party it does. But the Conservatives are more frequently aligned with faith, and those that have espouse, faith values and these types of things, whereas progressives are far more likely to have sort of a different background. As far as whether they're leaders from the same faction, in the Liberal Party, you'll often find that they align that way. Certainly the two tickets that ran when Scott Morrison and Josh Frydenberg are from similar factions, if you would like, which are called moderate conservatives, whereas the opposing forces in that discussion were Peter Dutton and Greg Hunt. Now, they're both far more conservative than these two. So it does work that way. It's a bit different in the Labor Party, which is a bit more structured, though.
Cool, thanks, Si. So the Labor Party is very structured when it comes to factions and who sits on what side. There's memberships, there's websites, there's Facebook groups. It's the whole shebang. The Labor Party is a very, very democratic institution behind the scenes as to voting and who gets appointed onto boards and selection committees and delegates. I remember Simon always used to say that the Labor Party are better campaigners because they spend all their time campaigning, which is largely true behind the scenes. And Jasmine just asked before that are party leaders generally from the same faction, or is it a mixed bag? I think Simon covered the Liberal side. On a federal level, at the moment, you've got Anthony Albanese, who's from the left faction, and then the Treasurer, which is the other high-ranking position, is as a Queenslander, Jim Chalmers, and he's from the right faction. And so there's left, right, left, right, left, right when they go down. And even when you get to a state level, there's all different sorts of bargaining and negotiations that go on behind closed doors as to who's going to get the top job, who'll get Premier, who'll get Health, who'll get Treasurer, and largely they're all split up depending on the numbers and who controls the amount of power and the amount of members that are in seats. So that you might find... Sorry to
interrupt. That left-right that you talked about, is that intentional? Are they trying to sort of represent more of the Australian public?
Yeah, I think so. So even like what Simon said before, there's this big continuum, and that's my left. Is that your right? If you guys are looking at me, is that right? Yeah, okay. So we'll go opposite. So on the far left, over here, you've got, parties out in the far left, the Greens, Labor, Liberals, Nationals, One Nation. And then even in the Labor part here, if you were to open that up, you've got people on the far left of the Labor Party, all the way through to here, which I'd say if you were any further right, you would be a Liberal Party member. And so these people here are all very much about pro-business, pro-economy. That's priority 1, 2, and 3. And then over here is far more geared towards social issues around health, education, culture. At a federal level, when we're looking at different bits of legislation to get brought forward, there are different subcommittees. And so any bits of legislation that come forward from the finance will go to a subcommittee largely made up of right faction Labor members. So if that makes sense, the Labor Party is a left-wing party, but there is a right faction within it on the continuum.
Just to jump in quickly there, I think to add something there, Brent, is that in the Labor Party, I think as well, they have defined agreements as to how many ministers from each faction. So you actually have a system whereby you can only have 4 members from the right faction, and then they actually have, if I'm not mistaken, a gender divide and then a demographic divide. So it might be just 2 from the right faction in Queensland and 1 from the left, and that has to be a woman. These types of things. So it's more structured in the Labor Party. They think about those things in the Libs, but they and certainly on female representation, they're quite lacking. But they don't have the structures that the Labor Party do.
Yeah, Simon's right. So if you're looking at a federal portfolio, you're going to be a federal minister, it all comes down to quotas or ratios, if you want to say, as to what state you're in, what gender you are, and what faction you belong to. And so they're all, depending on how many people of your party get elected, if more people in the right faction get elected, more people in the right faction will become ministers, more people on the left. So the defined agreements that Simon speaks about is basically just ratios. So if you're looking to climb the ladder, you always need a few things to go your way. But yeah, as Simon said, it is very structured on the Labor side of things. There's some pros to that. There's some cons as well. And it's not hard to find out which faction they are. But if you're ever meeting somebody, you can always come and ask someone like me to get that info for you. It just helps, I think, provide a bit of context to the person that you're talking to, and again, what their beliefs are and what their interests are, which I think we covered up before. Simon was talking about the maiden speech. Jump on their Facebook page, go have a look at their speeches, see what they've spoken about recently. Now, it's all about stroking people's egos. If you're able to walk into an office and go, hey, I read your speech last week on housing. You sit there and be like, whoa, these guys are on the ball. And that's all it takes. And they're far more likely to go out of their way to support you. The last one there is, what is your ask? Have an ask. If it might be contacts, it might be networking, it may even just be a photo op. It may just be a bit of branding, rapport building for you at the meeting. But have an ask of having a photo at the end at the bare minimum to make sure they remember your name and who you are. If it's a support for a project, if you're trying to lobby for a piece of legislation, just be very aware before you go in, what is your ask? Doesn't need to be brought up straight away, but have that clear. I've sat down in meetings, I'm sure Simon will be the same. We have a half an hour meeting and you go, what was that for? Like you could have just sent me an email. Like there's nothing that came out of that. So have an ask, have a piece of action that you want out of the meeting. So these are just some general points around how each level can help. Local councils, obviously anything grassroots. I know in Brisbane at the moment, they're running a heap of business assistance workshops and programs where you can go in, sit down with mentors. You can even mentor yourself. That's something that I've been considering doing as well, as a bit of a branding exercise to get my name out there. On a state level, business assistance programs, some monetary grants, staffing, traineeships, that's where it's really at. And so I think from a program point of view on the local level, and then staffing, traineeships, business grants from the state, that's why I identified those two at the start as sort of being the key level that businesses can benefit most from. Federally, there's not a huge amount of business sort of direct grants that are available at that level. They're more about large scale projects, businesses, tax incentives. But again, it's a really good way to get exposure, to go and meet with people. And I think for the most part, I don't think people care too much if you put up a Labor member on your Facebook page or a Liberal member on your Facebook page. I don't think people mind, as long as it's in the right spirit that, hey, today I went and met with Joe Bloggs. We had a great conversation about improving business and better serving the community. Nobody cares. And if they do, I don't think you should want to do business with them because they're just looking for trouble. These are some of the grants, Jasmine. I can send these around later on. I was about to say in the show notes because I listen to so many podcasts and that's what they say at the end. This will be in the show notes. I can send these around at the end. So Brisbane City Council have got some great community and safety grants going at the moment. As I mentioned, on a state level, I think that's where the party's at when it comes to businesses. There's always different amounts of different grants that are popping up here and there. The Queensland government's got a really awesome grant finder to help you, navigate and find through what the grants are. Federal does as well, but as I said before, they're more large-scale community grants. From what I've seen, the state government is really your key target of going out and finding out what grant opportunities there are. That may be your ask when you go have a meeting with your state member. Hey, I really need support in my business around staffing, training, whatever it is. They'll be able to point you in the right direction. And here's a really good example from a state level. These are the Small Business Digital Grants Program. So the adaptation grants probably took over this for a little bit during COVID. But this is a really good example of where there's pretty easy money up for grabs if you put in a solid submission. And these are, you can hire, it doesn't even need to be me. You can go and hire a marketing expert or digital expert, whatever it is. And even if you're a business, you can approach other businesses to say, why don't you apply for this grant? Then you can use my services. This one's not open at the moment. That's just a screenshot there. But even on this page here, the link that I sent through before, there's a Digital Connect newsletter. I think it's what it's called. You can subscribe to that and get all the updates as they come through. But that's a really good example of a business program that's open to pretty much everybody. There's a few caveats down the bottom, but even if it doesn't apply to you, you may find that people can apply to spend their funding on you. So it works both ways. It's just about trying to be creative and figure out where the best fit is going to be. So how Flex PR can help. This is what we do. We've done a couple of these already. So, guiding you through the process and finding the right decision maker. Last week at an expo, I started talking with an air conditioner installer who wants to get into schools and do maintenance on that. And so we're opening a few doors, trying to find the right person to speak to on how we're best going to go around that. Strategy and document preparation to have the ask ready to make it easy for them. I think the last thing they want in most cases is oodles and oodles of information and lots of words. The clearer and easier you can make your pitch without having all the documentation, the more likely it is to be read. I said before, they get hundreds of emails a day. They're getting bombarded from all sorts of situations or from different areas, from community, business, schools, party stuff, federal stuff, state stuff. There's a lot of noise going on all the time, on no matter what level they're on. So the more simple and easy to read your documentation can be, the better. And then, of course, like contacts and networking, just putting you in contact with the right people and knowing who's who in the zoo. And Jasmine, that's me done. Happy to take any questions.
Brilliant. Now, we did have a few, mostly from me. Oh, and I apologise.
That's okay.
That's the future Prime Minister crying in the background. So I might just have a look here. Oh. Okay, sorry about that, everyone. He's outraged at the election result. So we might have a look. Simon, there was a question I asked earlier about that unpacking that you mentioned, and you did put an answer in the chat here, but maybe if we can unpack the unpacking question a little bit. So that was sort of casting our minds back to a few minutes ago now when we talked about when an election happens and what is the result. Yeah, you mentioned this unpacking. So I'd love to know what's involved in that and how long it takes.
So take the LNP, for example. We'll use the Queensland election as the example. So the first thing that would be happening right now behind the LNP doors with a leader that's gone even still would be where did we lose? Who did we lose? What votes did we lose? And why did we lose them? And so the first fundamental thing is they will be saying is, did we lose because, for example, of policies that we put in place, or was it because, there was a particular swing in an area? So when you think about the Sunshine Coast and you think about the fact that that's an area where Labor actually probably is going to take 3 or 4 seats, because Glasshouse Mountains was another one that was currently was quite tight. There were 4 seats that were very tight, 3 of which moved. If that's an area where we've lost, then why did we lose it? You also lost, I think, they lost a fair bit of primary vote down the Gold Coast as well. So those areas are pretty well populated by an older demographic. And so they would be saying, well, we've lost older people. And that's to that front page that Brent put up before, that unpacking that is already being done by some in a little bit. And you will see that start to sort of trickle out in various sort of news sites. But what they will do with that is start to go, okay, if that's the reason, if we lost because these people stopped voting for us, why did they stop voting for us? And that's far more, it's far more difficult to understand. And typically you do, rather than the initial interaction, which is a dare I say, a qualitative research. You need a quantitative research afterwards, which is, yes, those are the numbers, but if I'm going to speak to, if it's older people we lost and they're sort of 50 and above, I'm going to speak to as many people 50 and above until I realise the answer. That's the quantitative analysis that you would do to say, if these are the people that didn't vote for us, well, why not? So what did matter to you at this election? And we can guess, and you would guess that it would be to do with safety and health and fear of coronavirus and these types of things. But whilst you can guess at these things, those having been a little bit a part of some of those analyses, you always find things you didn't realise. There's usually one nugget of a thing. You're at a forum in the midst of wherever it is, at a town hall or a pub or an RSL, and someone says, "Oh yeah, and you didn't really talk about this much," and then that sort of goes down. You go down a traction. The other one that was a big post-mortem, and probably Brent can speak to a bit on this, is after the federal election with Bill Shorten, you actually had a complete revamp, and Anthony Albanese's keeping his powder dry at the moment by not announcing policies, because essentially one of the things they think they did wrong, whether that's real or perceived or not, is that they think they went out too much on policy. And there's very much a small target opposition is a fairly well-known sort of strategy. So with some, now Bill Shorten's taken the cake from John Hewson in the early 90s as the one that went out with a big policy decision and then lost spectacularly.
And Simon, just while I've got you here talking about the Queensland election, is this, I guess, an interesting case study from a federal perspective as well? Because Queensland turned very liberal in the last federal election, and now we seem to be, I don't know, going back to Labor. Is Queensland, to use an American terminology, a real swing state?
Queensland is the swing state in as far as that goes. I mean, you can only go back to, when was it, 2011? Campbell Newman won with 81 or 80 seats of an 89-seat parliament. I mean,
Palaszczuk had like 6 seats or something as head of the Labor Party. She sort of fell into there by accident, didn't she?
Yeah.
She was the accidental premier 4 years later, or 3 years later, 2012, I think it was, and then 3 years later in 2015, she was the accidental premier because that we did not anticipate, and I was campaigning for the Libs at that time. We did not anticipate a Palaszczuk win, and she won in minority with Peter Wellington. So, Queensland swings wildly. It is well known for swinging wildly. But look, is it an interesting case study with this Palaszczuk one? I'd suggest no, for the fact that the federal and the voters, as much as a person is smart and people are dumb is a common phrase used, but when you think about the populace of the voters of Queensland, they can definitely differentiate between federal and state quite effectively and have done that quite frequently. The factors at a federal election are very different to those of the state, and what we've seen. So, an interesting stat that probably typifies this is between the 1970 and about a month ago, a sitting opposition only lost seats in a parliament 3 times at a federal or state level in Australia. So that is, they only went backwards 3 times in all the elections that have been run since 1970 until about a month ago. Since a month ago, we've had 2 elections in Australia, in ACT and in Queensland. Both oppositions went backwards. So what that tells you, and it is extrapolating a little bit, but is that incumbency in a crisis is heavily, heavily important. And so that's probably what's more at play in my view. It's just an opinion, but it is probably what's more at play in this election. And similarly, if Morrison goes early, and early by, I would suggest probably late next year, August, September, I would suggest he would be doing that for the same reason.
Okay, so it's strategic.
Mm-hmm.
Cool. And I think if everyone can stick around for one more question, Brent, did you want to pick up Chris's question about turnover post-election?
Yeah, so definitely the short answer is yes, there can be a high turnover in staff, but especially when there's a change of government. So from a ministerial point of view, at a federal level. And Simon, I don't know the numbers, you may know off the top of your head, but there's double the amount of, is it double? Might even be more, double the amount of staffing positions available to whoever's in government as to whoever is in opposition. So if you're in government and you're a ministerial staffer, you're obviously very highly rated within the party, no matter what side you're on. And then if you lose government, more often than not, they will try and find a spot or a job for you, but which may mean you trickle down the ladder a little bit, which means somebody else down the ladder might get pushed out for whatever reason. So there's a lot of different shuffling of the deck chairs when there's a change in government, and that goes the other way as well. So when you win government, suddenly there's a bonanza of jobs that are available, and so it goes both ways. Simon, did you have something?
Yeah, look, it's interesting because it happens at when you change leaders as well. So Turnbull to Morrison, and so forth. What you find is that the same thing happens as a lot of turnover.
So one other question for you guys, 'cause I'm not sure if you I'm sure you guys will be very much around it and be taking a keen look at it. Obviously, there's been a big election in Queensland. There's been the ACT, but there's been a lot of political issues happening here in Victoria. Can you shed some light on the decision-making process of a premier or a government, and what the likelihood is that a creeping assumption would actually happen and a government wouldn't actually be able to take ownership of their decisions and those sorts of things? Because there's a lot of question marks around what's happening with the Andrews government, like him or loathe him, whichever way you go. There's a lot of question marks there. That, when you're in that position, are there clear hierarchies? Is there a clear decision maker? Is this a bit of a fabrication coming out of the Andrews government, or is it something that could realistically happen?
Simon, you're working state level. Do you want to go for it?
Yeah, and it's difficult for me because I still work in state level and I'm actually quite involved in some of the decisions. So one area that I've got a little bit of carriage of in Tasmania is actually the hotel quarantine system within Tasmania. So I'm actually I know that system quite well, and have had a little bit to do with some Victorian sort of stuff. So I won't betray any things I'm not allowed to. But in short, in a crisis, and specifically when you get a state of emergency or a state of crisis, the decision-making changes. So in a typical, without those state of emergency, state of crisis situations, what you have is a decision-making process, which is Cabinet makes the decisions. The Premier or Prime Minister is the head of the Cabinet. The ministers are responsible for those decisions and are accountable for those decisions, but the cabinet as a whole will buy into major decisions. In a crisis, you can't have that, because you can't lead by consensus in a crisis. It doesn't work. And so what we do is by issuing a state of emergency, you change the structures, and all of a sudden the person that has authority changes from the cabinet to a particular person or a particular group or whatever that is. In Tasmania, where that lays is basically, and it would be the same, I would guess, in Victoria, I don't know this over there, but I'd guess it would be the Premier, his Chief of Staff, the head of Treasury or head of his department, and whoever the police commissioner is at the day, because that's the head of the state emergency sort of service sector, because it's called an emergency. So that's the line of sort of how it works. So the question and does Daniel Andrews have an issue with specifically the health minister, Jenny Mikakos, or whatever her surname is, I can't recall, but would she have been accountable for that decision? I don't believe so. Knowing the system how it is, I believe that would have been a decision that was taken actually at an operational level. It was probably taken by the head of the department, whether it's health or communities or whatever it is. I think that it's likely that is where it occurred, and it would have been taken in consultation of the state emergency body, which is usually the head of a series of agencies, but the head decision maker is probably the state of emergency, the police commissioner, and these types of things. Would Daniel Andrews have been the one to make that call? No, he wouldn't have. it's incredibly unlikely. He would have been briefed on it after the call had been made, or the decision that was being made, but he would not have made the call himself. Does that mean he shouldn't be accountable for that decision? Well, that's another story. But at the end of the day, the other thing about the interesting thing that I'm observing about Victoria is the polls are still loving, and the Victorians are still loving Andrews. And the reason probably is that that he's the only one there. He's the only one getting oxygen. So even though it's, dare I say, he's giving bad news, has been giving bad news for basically 6 months straight, he's the only one that's actually been doing that. Yeah, right. Yep, no worries, mate. I'm going to have to go in a second. So he's been giving that that bad news, but he's been taking all the oxygen, so no one can hear from Michael O'Brien, and so forth. So I'm actually going to have to run. There's a meeting with the minister and a group of people in this room in about 6 seconds. So I've got to go.
That's a good way to end it. Thanks, Simon.
I'll leave you guys, but thanks for the opportunity, and I'll catch you later.
Thank you so much. And
thank you.
We have run over because we can, of course, talk about this topic all day. It's incredibly interesting. I'm sure we could probably spark a conversation on Facebook as well, Brent, about some of these topics. But that was incredible. Hopefully you guys got as much value out of it as I did. Certainly how to contact your member, get in front of them, go via Facebook Messenger. That was a hot tip that I would never have thought of. I just assume they're not looking at that sort of stuff, but there's good people like Brent sitting on the other end. So that was excellent. Really great question at the end there, Chris. That was, I'm sure that's super topical down in Victoria right now.
Yes, yeah, and it's like that's honestly one of the better webinars I've been to in a while. It's an extremely interesting topic, I believe, and even if it's just a little bit of a lifting of the curtain, it's I find. You touched on it at the very beginning. I think there's a sense of distrust as well. I've been thinking about that question. I think part of it is that we don't actually know how it works. We don't know what happens behind the scenes. We don't know who's actually pulling the strings and what the goal is. And if we can get a little bit more information like this, it's just it's really compelling. It's really interesting. I just want to talk about it more because it's extraordinarily interesting, I think.
And just quickly, 90% of them on both sides, and the other thing to blow your mind is that they're actually quite chummy most of the time. Behind closed doors, they genuinely are. And 90% of them are good, hardworking, honest people who do just want the best, that are playing under a different set of the rules to the rest of us. Are there a few crazy people there? Yes, of course, but most of them are very good, genuine people. More on the progressive side, if I might say, if I could just throw that in there at the end with my own bias.
Yeah, it's a lot like business in a way, actually. And even when Simon was talking about, the unpacking of an election and actually talking to people and finding their insights, as a strategist, that's customer research. We do that in business. So, it's just another form of business, I suppose. And they're salespeople too. So
if you think of any other questions or anything you're unsure on, by all means, flick us an email. I'll send through my presentation to Jasmine as well, and you can pass that out.
Yes, and hopefully the recording works.
You shouldn't say that, Brent, because I'll harass you from now on.
If I know Brent, he will get back to you very quickly and with a smile on his face.
Okay.
All right, everyone. Thank you. We'll see you at the next webinar.
Thanks, guys.
Put it on, Jasmine. Thanks for doing it, Brent. See you later.